Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar where we'll be taking a little bit of a walk through some emissions modeling tool that C40 has developed to help support our member cities in the development of their climate action plans. My name is Malcolm. I'm the head of climate action for North America, and I've been working with Houston a little bit to support this effort, and we'll be continuing to support them as they move forward with their climate action planning. I know that, excuse me, let's see what we've got. I'll continue to sort of try and structure this so that it's relevant, recognizing the background that many of you have with the working group and with the city to date. My understanding is that really we're here to try and give you an essence of the capabilities of the modeling tool and what it can provide in terms of supporting emissions reduction pathways. So with that, if I could ask you all to mute your lines, just to keep the feedback down to a minimum. The workshop, if you will, the webinar today rather, has pretty straightforward structure to it. I'm not planning to use the slide deck very much. We'll be walking around the tool itself. But first we'll look at how the modeling is set up, how do we get the basis for the city that we're talking about, because the tool is intended for use across a number of different cities. Secondarily, looking at future emissions and emissions reduction targets, often considered to be sort of your BAU case, your business as usual, where are emissions going. And then the real core of the program, the emissions reduction actions. What are we able to model within the tool from an emissions reduction point of view, and then what are the results that it gives us? Like what can we actually glean for the insights that are to be gained? And then finally, a quick run through of the ability to set up different scenarios, different reduction scenarios, to see how different policy actions or groups of policy actions can influence emission reductions. And of course, at the end, there'll be time for Q&A. There will be a question and answer session at the end. So if I jump straight in, the tool itself is an Excel-based tool. It's there to be widely used. It's not there intended to be a proprietary platform. So it's set up really to be applicable across all standard Office environments. And as you can see there, there are 5 major areas to which the tool is broken down into, corresponding with those pieces that we just walked through. Looking at emissions forecasting, trajectories and targets, what are the action pieces that we can do, the scenarios that they result in, and finally setting the model up. So let's start with setup on the right-hand side there, primarily because this is always going to be your first step. And really what the setup module is looking to do is establish the characteristics for the city that has been modeled. Number of people, population, building archetype, weather, so on and so forth. And this really allows us to build the base of the model around the parameters that are determining energy use and hence greenhouse gas emissions within the city. So as you can see there, we have the high-level city characteristics, and then the years for which we want the emissions modeling to take place. The model can work over 3 time horizons. The base year is typically the year from which you'll be pulling your emissions inventory. As we'll see, that's part of the setup in terms of where the baseline emissions come from. But then what are your target years in future? Here currently set to be 2030, 2040, and 2050. Standard population metrics, and also a consideration around commuter entry to the city. For Houston, small number, doesn't really affect the emissions profile of a city too much, but we do work with cities such as Buenos Aires that see a 50 to 60% increase in population during the standard work hours during the week. GDP is primarily there as a reference case so that when we look at metrics, some cities wish to show greenhouse gas information or energy information normalized by GDP or population. So this is really what the GDP value comes down to. And then secondarily, looking at population and economic growth factors. Really, these are what determine your business as usual growth. For many cities, they don't have specific sector by sector growth values for emissions. And so it's possible to build a BAU associated with either population, or we know that emissions are correlated to economic activity. So putting together a GDP growth factor per person allows for a slightly more accurate approach to establishing the business as usual emissions growth. I won't go into detail around defining the emissions factors, but the model does have the ability to specify non-standard emission factors or local emission factors. The model is typically set up to use national emission factors, but those values can be manually edited. And I should say overall that the model does have an innate database to it that is being built up over time to try and pull some of the most standard values and factors that are used in calculations, be it emissions factors, be it appliance performance, be it vehicle standards, whatever it may be. Now, obviously, dependent on the country in which a city is, the quality of that data or the scale at which that data exists varies. For the US, the data is good. Typically, it's at the state level, and that's the default for most of the parameters that we were able to find. And so this page is really the high-level entry of city-specific values. But you can see along the top, there are a number of other areas. You can enter building energy data, electricity data, solid waste, wastewater, transportation, because these are the biggest areas of emissions for cities. And so for each of these, there is another level of specificity to which we're starting to look at the characteristics of a city. So in this case, we're looking at the building stock. We have space for total number of residential units. Income cohort for the developed world, it's always 100% high income because the model is intended for global use. And so anything over an average household income of $13,000 constitutes high. And similarly, we can start to break down the proportion of houses by building stock, or rather by archetype. So whether we're considering, as it seems here, we've got about a 50-50 split, whereas obviously, say we were modeling New York, you'd have significantly more apartments than houses. And similarly, we can start to define further aspects of this. So that really what we're looking to do, and we don't have time or really the need to go through each one of these, but really what I want to convey is that we use this section to set up the archetypal built form of the city so that we know what it is that's informing the building's emission actions. Naturally, if you're looking to do, say, I don't know, changes to insulation levels, it matters whether we're doing this to a house or an apartment building or whatever it might be. Similarly, there is a section specifically for municipal public buildings around lighting, because we know that the municipal sector is often leading on this, and many of our cities have asked us to be able to call this out specifically. Furthermore, there's the ability to look at a very detailed breakdown of fuel use. So for residential buildings, for example, if we're looking at the heating system, you can break it down so that you've got 3 fuel types for each one. And then of the residential building stock, what percentage uses, in this case, natural gas, residential fuel oil, or gas oil for heating. And then the baseline sort of system that is in place. And that's available for all of the different archetypes of building. You can see that typically we break things down by residential buildings, office space, retail, hotels, hospital, and warehousing. So really all this model is doing is building up the base case for the city as it stands now, so that it can be calibrated against the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The inventory that is supplied by the city through the GPC, the Global Protocol for Greenhouse Gas Emissions at the community scale, is what underpins the baseline emissions. If we go back to basic data and inventory, go to the inventory input page. This is the greenhouse gas emissions inventory that has been supplied and approved previously outside of this work for the city as a whole. And you can see that it breaks down residential energy, commercial, manufacturing, and this is the information that's used to build up that baseline set of emissions for your base year that we selected as 2014. Without wanting to go into excessive levels of detail, looking at electricity data, the grid mix can be specified and broken down, typically by percentage, as this is the most common values that can be found. But we do have the ability to structure this by specific intensities or generation capacity. For solid waste data, again, this is an area where quite good data normally exists, and so we can get total value of tons disposed, as well as waste composition. And then for each of the streams, so what happens to each of those streams in terms of its final disposal. And really, again, this is looking to provide a characterization of the emissions that come from that waste. There is the ability to specify also the nature of some of those facilities where there's big variations. So does the landfill gas have a landfill gas management system? And what sort of wastewater treatment do we have? Those sorts of factors. And then similarly, it's the ability to look at your assumptions for future disposal. If you know that you'll be using the same facility, but there are going to be changes at that facility, you can make some level of alteration to those facilities, not always across the board. The model does have the ability to of course, consider what is incinerated, not just what is sent to landfill. And for wastewater, once again, you get the list of different treatments that are available globally. But for Houston, this is going to be a much smaller limited set because you have active water treatments in place. Driven by, of course, consumption levels, one of the biggest things that can be changed, and whether there's going to be improvements to water loss in the future. And for some cities, I must admit, for Houston, I'm not so sure, but water conveyance can often be a significant energy drain. So there is the ability to look at water conveyance in this. And finally, if we then look to the advanced settings for transportation, the model works based upon a trip generation value. So how many trips per day per resident, and then what is the miles traveled, what is the VKT or VMT traveled for those residents. This is probably a good point to note that the model does run on metric. It does work on the SI system. There isn't currently a setting to be able to change it to imperial. Those changes have to be made offline. And as you might expect, it's the mode split within the current passenger travel habits that really are defining the nature of the emissions as well as the distance traveled. And so there is the ability to specify the current mode split. And you'll see where possible, we've noted the exact data sources for these characteristic inputs for the city. And then similarly, there's the ability to look further in detail at how those vehicles are used, what the nature of those vehicles is. So distribution of vehicles by fuel within each of those classes. And you'll see, I should say, that when we look at the set of transportation emissions as a whole, we're primarily concerned with passenger vehicles and light duty, medium duty trucks, but we do also have the ability to look to motorcycles, taxis, moto taxis, microbus, minibus, much more applicable for other parts of the world, but also standard bus and BRT options, as well as various rail options and the local in-city ferry service can also be specified. And then, as you might expect, the vehicle fuel efficiency is also established for each of the different fuel types, so that we can really build up the fuel use of that fleet based upon how far people are traveling and the different modes that they're taking. So all of this is used to set up the model, if you will. And what this gives us between that basic setup and then the growth factors that we had, the growth factors that we had under business as usual, we can see where our emissions are likely to be going under that case. So the top line here is that business as usual growth. That's, let me make it a little larger. The baseline year was 2014 with 33 million tons of emissions. And then under the growth that we set up, we're looking by 2050 to be hitting 46 million or so. And then under this page, this is where we can start to specify emissions reduction targets. So we established that we'd like our interim years to be 20, 30, 40, and 50. So we got questions. So yeah, all the calculations are done in SI units. The inputs have to be metric and all the outputs will be metric. Everything from a calculation point of view is ultimately normalized, so it's done per unit. But in terms of inputs, yeah, the model has to accept metric inputs. In terms of what we're looking at, currently, purely for example's sake, we've set emissions reduction targets of 13% for 2030, 20% for 2040, and 100% for 2050. And that's what gives you this dotted line. Everything's looking like reasonably steady reduction up to 2040, and then hitting this huge reduction at the end. Again, these values are in here at the moment purely for demonstration purposes. The green line that you see there is the result of something, some research that C40 did with Arup, the engineering consultancy, back in 2016. And it was a piece of work called Deadline 2020. And what it did was looked at global emissions and the global carbon budget, and then assigned 2 different cities globally based upon population, and then scaled to the C40 membership. What is their fair and equitable path towards carbon neutrality? The IPCC is clear that the world's biggest and leading cities need to be carbon neutral by 2050 at the latest. And so what does that mean? The Paris Agreement was pretty clear at the national scale, but what does that mean for cities at a much more local scale? And so the way the model worked was it took 2 metrics. It was income per person and GDP per person. So if you are a low income and low emission per person, the city is allowed. So this is typically cities through Africa, the developing world. There is allowed to be some absolute emissions growth, but the emissions per person generally need to stay steady through until about the 2025, 2030 period before the emissions starts to need to come down. And in all cases, cities need to hit neutrality by 2050. So then there's obviously the case where you can have high income and low emissions. This is often the developed world that has access to large hydro, so the likes of Oslo and Vancouver as well. These cities would have a different trajectory. They need to achieve a steady decline in their emissions. The reason that it's steady is that the city is already emitting at a reasonably low level, and it has time to get to the zero emissions of 2050. The other option is low income and high greenhouse gas emissions. In this case, cities need to be able to cut their emissions much more rapidly, but because they're low income, there is a slight difference in pace when we need to look at the global equity. And then finally, the category, as you might expect for many of the US and European cities, is high emissions rate per person and high income. And these are the cities that really need to find ways, if we're to stay within the carbon budget, of taking rapid action to cut our emissions. So this analysis was done for each of our member cities, and the reports were provided to each of the cities. And so that is this green curve. It's primarily there as a reference against some significant work that was done for all of the C40 member cities. So this is your baseline page, really. This is the sort of look forward in the future, but really what matters most is action development. This is really let's start looking at the actions that take place. So you can see the wedge diagram that's there on the page. Same information as before. We have the BAU emissions along the top, the suggested cut to emissions, the trajectory shown for reference in the broken line, the hashed line there. And then a tabulated summary of the chart for the base year plus each of the interim years. It tells you what your baseline emissions forecast is, what you're targeting to try to be achieved, the allowable emissions associated with that, what you've got with your actions, the difference between them, the allowable gap, and then just expressing that as a percentage value. And finally, again, we can, it gives you the detail around intensity, carbon tons per person per year. So the actions are broken down. I'll walk us through the list to start with and then provide a little more detail. Actions are broken down into electricity generation. So what can be done around electricity generation, building energy use specifically, industrial and other stationary energy, recognizing that building use is primarily focused on those residential, hospital, warehouse facilities that we saw previously. Transportation, urban planning in terms of the impacts of urban form, and then finally waste. And there is a little section at the end to see what we want to do with residual emissions. This is basically just filling in the wedge chart at the top if we wish, if there are commitments to offsetting or just leaving a wait and see approach to the remaining emissions. Yes, Houston is a member of the C40. C40 is currently, I believe, 92 cities around the world. Hopefully I could get all the US cities, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, New York, Boston, DC, New Orleans, Austin, Houston, Philadelphia, and I think that might be all of the US cities. Forgive me for any other cities that I forget. So Houston, yeah, is a member of the C40. So from a modeling point of view, what are we looking to do? For experience has told us that trying to get to exact modeling parameters is time consuming, it's difficult, it's not necessarily the utility of high-level strategic planning such as we're doing with the climate action plan or with this tool, the intended use of the tool. There are so many different futures or ways forward when we look at emissions reductions, policies and scenarios, that finding ways to more rapidly assess what different futures look like was more useful to cities. And so as such, what we have structured is basically 3 levels of reduction. The first of which is basically a continuation along a slightly modified business as usual. So that's current trend. Business as usual assumes that there's going to be no changes and emissions grow exactly as they have historically based upon, as we saw, population and GDP. Whereas current trend, we know that there's some level of new policy coming into place, or that there will be some level of innate improvement to efficiency in many sectors. So you could conceptually, where you see the check mark under custom currently, you could put a check against current trend. Moderate, I'll come to shortly, because it sits in between current trend and maximum. Maximum is, in essence, the full technological shift that we're looking at. So currently we're looking at distributed renewables. Maximum would be, what if we covered every single bit of rooftop space in a PV panel? We know that the maximum case is not necessarily realistic. For some policies, you could argue it may be. But a lot of the time, it's not, okay, you could say it's realistic, but it may not be plausible or feasible to achieve it. But what the maximum case does do is provides a reference case for when you're having discussions with decision makers. It's easy for people to understand the current trend or where things are headed currently. But what's the absolute maximum potential that we're talking about? It's more a reference point than I'd say a specific reduction scenario, because then the tool almost becomes useless. You just go along and you put a check mark in everything against maximum. And then in between the current trend and the maximum, as you might expect, is moderate. And that moderate setting is typically based upon, for the technological changes we're talking about, the anticipated uptake curve for the technology. What does a moderate case look like for distributed renewables uptake, for example? And so to give you a demonstration, this is our wedge chart as it stands at the moment. You can see electricity generation is the big yellow portion at the top. And I'll come to the custom settings shortly, but we've currently selected that it's custom. But then what if we wanted to look at current trends? You double click this and you get the pop-up window that tells you what the assumptions are for that current trend setting. So in 2030, 5% of buildings have solar PV, 8% of buildings, 11% of buildings for each of the years. And then for the sake of argument, say we want moderate grid decarbonization. Double click this cell. As you might expect, it takes a little bit of time to do the calculations. Similarly, you get the little summary of what has been selected, and we're not seeing a huge change in this wedge here. We're seeing reasonably small amounts of difference based upon these. And so really what the structure of the model allows you to do is build different scenarios. You can select your current trend, your building envelope, whatever might be, And as such, you can start to build what different policy scenarios might look like, and then see what the impact is. The model's just running the calculations. See what the impact is upon your overall emissions. This is, in essence, an approach to rapid prototyping that allows cities to really anticipate where the emissions are going. Yeah, I'm just waiting for the model to catch up. There we go. And you can see now that we're starting to see the changes in that wedge diagram, so that you can start to use this as an exploratory approach. You have your BAU set, you have your target set, and you can see rapidly what changes to a whole number of different policy areas might be. So it's worth emphasizing at this point that what we're talking about here are technological changes. It's very difficult to model social programs or changes in policy directly. You have to make an inference around what the technology impact of the policy is likely to be. Got questions in chat. Under industrial, the ways to model voluntary decrease in greenhouse, adapting better air control technology to improve emissions. So yeah, I'll walk through each of these different areas and I'll answer the question on industrial shortly. So for electricity generation, as you might expect, renewables and grid decarbonization are your biggest opportunities. On residential or office space, we have the ability to look at how efficient new construction is, as well as the impacts around retrofits. From a heating and cooling point of view on envelope. And then space cooling and space heating are called separately. Water heating, cooking fuels, which for Houston, this will be small. This won't have a huge impact, whereas for the developed world, we know this is different. Lighting is a separate consideration. All other basically equipment and plug loads that aren't captured under lighting and cooking. Street lighting is captured because of the way the GPC, the inventory protocol, is structured. Street lighting is captured here. Informal settlements you don't need to worry about. Houston's fully housed. And then there is the ability to specify other generic building energy reductions through the model. On the industrial side, so industrial is very difficult to model because industrial sites vary so significantly from one city to another in the nature of the industry that's there. So I would say that the industrial section is very high level. It doesn't have the granularity and calculation for the other stationary areas or transportation, because it's very difficult to characterize in general terms what an industrial set of facilities looks like. So because of that, the only significant approaches that the model is able to capture are an overall approach to fuel switch and an overall approach to efficiency. And all this is doing is taking the greenhouse gas emissions inventory that was supplied and then switching to particular fuel types or switching or increasing the efficiency against those reported greenhouse gas numbers. And this is probably a good time to look at this custom option. So at the moment, everything is set to custom. So I explained there were 3 sort of rapid prototype levels, but by pressing the white C and the blue circle at the end of any of the lines, you will always get a customized page to show what the major parameters are that you're able to adjust for. So here, there's a significant list of fuel switching that you can put in place applied to scope 2. And similarly, you can do a little bit with construction. but really, for industrial, it comes back to fuel switching and efficiency. So here, and as with all of the settings, you have the ability to reset to baseline, just turn it back to the original baseline year, so you can start changing the parameters quickly. Perhaps a little easier to understand if we look at the custom settings for distributed renewables. For each of the years that are reported, you specify the average number of residential buildings that have a PV unit, what the size of the unit is, and then you get some reported values. The gray cells are always the user input values, and the white are the reported values. And it's broken down by residential and commercial. Let's keep things moving, let's look at transportation. Again, mode shift, getting people out of their vehicles is one of the most significant ways to reduce emissions. Getting them into walk bike has a different effect as to getting them into transit, so we can adjust accordingly. And then looking at fuel switching for passenger vehicles versus transit, and looking at vehicle efficiency improvements. We could do other transportation reductions, although this is typically captured under current trends. There is the ability to adjust that somewhat. So purely, for example, if we're looking into fuel switch or change the efficiency of transit vehicles, you can specify what the changes are for each of the intervention years by the full suite of vehicle classes we discussed. So microbus, minibus, bus standard, BRT, subway, so on and so forth. So I don't want to go through everything in detail, but to give you the sense that through these custom settings, you do have the ability to change the details of the emissions reduction actions that are in place. So this is really the main page where we set up the emissions, and you can, obviously there's the wedge diagram to give the summary, but there's also the tabulated version if you want the specific values that are there in place. It is worth noting that there is the ability for each of the action areas to assign what portion of that action is attributable to the local government, because we recognize that policy actions aren't always the responsibility of one level of government. So you can have some level of split responsibility. And what this allows us to do is really look at, when we see that overall wedge diagram, what portion of that diagram is, what portion of this figure here is attributable to the local government, and what portion is attributable to other levels of government. So custom options for, was there a particular transportation one that you wanted to look at? Any others? No. So for transportation, right, okay, so the city allocation authority for transportation. So mode shift is currently set to 100% for local, passenger vehicle fuel switch and efficiency. Let's make this one 100, this one 0. And make this 0. Then what we can do is, if we go to the action development, this is the standard way of presenting the information. You'll see that there's both yellow and purple. There's the electricity generation and transport efficiency in this case, and fuel switch are the big opportunities. because the colors remain the same, it shows that it's all attributed to the local government. But what we can do is, based upon what we just changed, we can see that because the electricity grid was 100% set to national or state level impacts, i.e. not local, this changed to a gray portion. So when you're rendering the graph, you're able to see what portion of each of the wedges is gray, i.e. the piece that the city is not responsible for. So I am cognizant that we're running up on time, and I do want to leave time for more questions and answers. And so based upon that, let's take a look at the scenario piece. So what we have currently is the ability to show our current scenario. That line in yellow is the emissions reductions that correspond to the wedge diagram that we were just looking at. And through the comparisons, you're able to see, okay, this is the live scenario as we have things set up. Before I started making changes, I'd saved it as scenario 1. So we were achieving 35,000 tons of reductions, and now because I made some changes to, you'll see most of all, the electricity generation, I've now only achieved 25,000 tons of reductions, but I've also managed to increase to some extent the settings for transportation. And so what you're able to do as part of this scenario modeling approach is, as you can see, build up 6 different scenarios so that you can compare one scenario to another one in terms of what the reductions potential is for those. How do you offset in models? The model does not, the model doesn't have any calculations associated with offsetting. Under action development, if we scroll right down to the bottom, there is the ability to specify offsets, but it is simply a statement input by the user as to the number of tons that are offset in that year. So it's not an offset calculator. What it's doing really is, all it is doing is providing another value or another piece of the wedge to potentially fill in this gap here. There's no calculation capability for offsetting. Cool, thanks. And so with that, yeah, I do want to leave time for questions. So here, let me. We're all now unmuted, so if you have anything important to say it.
Probably by 3. I don't know.
If you've got questions, either please type them in the chat box.
I'm gonna wear sunscreen.
And I'll do my best to answer your questions and see what more I can do.
So this is Bruce Race. Can you hear me?
It can take about a week.
Hi, Kennedy. Hi, Bruce.
So, you know, in the U.S. we have a lot of federal policies
So I didn't realize
that we'll probably have to.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Hi, guys. If you're not asking a question, can you mute your line? We're getting a bit of background. Thanks very much. Hi, Bruce. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
So, you know, for in Houston, you know, maybe a third or more of our emissions could be reduced just by implementing the Obama-era Clean Power Plan.
Okay.
And CAFE standards for cars. So in the U.S., we have these policy thresholds that would be helpful to see in the models. And when we start to look at the percentage breakdown. Also in transportation,
yeah, I'll do that, and then I can.
We've looked at things mode by mode and looked at VMT reduction and fuel efficiency and emerging technologies for that. And so we ran through 4 scenarios and arrived at a technical limitations definition on fuel efficiency and a 20% reduction in VMT, which is pretty aggressive for Houston on the VMT reduction side. And, but we ran through a set of scenarios. We built our own model for that. So on the custom side, we want to make sure that the way we informed our targets, creating our targets for that, can be transitioned into this format. And so I haven't gotten under the hood of this software, but I want to make sure that we don't lose the work we've done.
Absolutely.
Some of the other teams have not had a chance to set targets using modeling software, so there'll be a bit more back and forth with them. But we're pretty close on what our expectations are.
Absolutely. No, and I think your question or the point you raise is very well received in that it sounds like the analysis that you've done is more sophisticated, more involved, and more informed than what this software is intended to do. The Pathways tool is there as an entry point for cities to look at the greenhouse gas reduction potential for different options. It's not meant as the be-all and the end-all and the most comprehensive platform. It's a strategic.
As long as a custom setting permits us to enter the work that reflects the sort of level of policy focus that we have as a city.
Exactly. And that's why the custom setting exists. It's a mechanism to allow a much more detailed approach to doing the greenhouse gas reduction. So if you have done the analysis outside and you have a very good sense of, for the sake of argument, what the mode shift is likely to be, or the vehicle efficiency limits that you've identified, you have the ability to specify those within the model, and it will reflect those as it renders the wedge diagram. So
and on the building side, we have, our U.S. Energy Information Administration's got has a big database by building type. It was a lot more detail than just, for example, single family versus apartments.
yeah,
And so I don't know how detailed our building group got, but there's an opportunity for us to use available information to develop policies that'll be more customized for Houston.
yes. Yeah.
And so again, it's one of these things about how to work on the alignments for that. Also, other policies that inform development patterns just does not seem to have a setting for paving or for infrastructure.
No.
So,
You have to
do some modeling
okay,
with the paving and infrastructure, the difference between a sprawl model and more compact development can be as high as 10 or 15%.
Yes.
Of your lifespan emissions, and that's a huge
I have an appointment
policy
11, so I'll be
decision.
here.
Can I interrupt? Sorry, guys. Someone's not on mute, and we can hear your call at the moment. Can't quite figure out who it is. There's a few of you.
Okay. Yeah, and then.
Yeah, Bruce. I'm going to mute everyone, and Bruce, I'll find you.
At 9.
Okay.
There's more of the Resilient Houston from 9 to 11 over at City Hall. If you're interested in that. That's fine. And then let me see what else.
Hey, Rachel, we can hear you.
Rachel, it's you. Yeah.
All right. So,
we might have got it.
Malcolm, did you remember my question?
Yes, absolutely. So,
okay, so it's about paving. So there's just some sort of placeholder for sprawl, which is a big issue in the United States,
yes.
And it's a big issue here in terms of how we inform that, and it can be a rather large percentage of our overall lifespan emissions. So I don't see a way of capturing those impacts.
Yeah, so to some extent it'll turn up here under transit-oriented development.
Yeah, that's a co-benefit, but the direct emissions because I've done some other modeling, we get some really big numbers if you look at, the way we grow in Houston and way they grow in, say, New York City.
Yes.
And so the VMT, if we look at a 20% reduction in VMT, that means we're performing like Portland on a VMT reduction perspective, and that's pretty aggressive.
Yes.
And you still can't get there without people understanding the implications for growing outward rather than growing in a more responsible infill pattern.
Yes. Yep. Yes, it's true. The reason the model currently only captures transit-oriented development is because that's what we've been able to find broad literature supporting in terms of what better parameters are in terms of...
I'd like to share my research with you then on that.
Yeah, please do. No, we're always happy to add more to this. It is a significant undertaking to develop this tool, but it is still intended to try and keep it current and up to date as new work comes in. So it's you've got my email from the meeting invite, so please send me whatever you've got, and I'd be happy to talk as well.
I have a question also. This is David Abraham. Can you hear me?
I can. Hi, David.
Hi. Thank you so much. This was an amazingly important presentation you just gave us. So my question is with regards to capturing the major impact that our port of Houston generates in our region, and in that complex we have major petrochemical activity,
right?
Which as stationary sources generate possibly considerable amounts of methane.
Mm-hmm.
And the other consideration out there, which a lot of people don't capture, is the freight and the transportation types of impacts that we have from being the largest freight port in the country, or the second largest freight port in the country? So my question is with regards to, I heard you say that we could attribute some of the causes to the city, but can we attribute some of the sources to different industries, or are there other ways that we can capture the generations by specific other stakeholders, major stakeholders in a large metro complex?
Not at the stakeholder level. So inventory reporting for cities, as I said, is done by this GPC protocol, and that breaks it down by basically emissions sector. And of course, in many inventories, a large point source or a specific stakeholder will have their emissions as a single line item in that inventory. But this model uses the aggregate values for sectors. It's not able to capture every individual line by line item. Because you can imagine, like, the complexity somewhat gets out of control for something that's limited by Excel's capabilities. But
so I don't know if you've seen a map of the city, and specifically on that eastern side,
yes,
where the port complex is, because the city of Houston only technically owns the land, with the actual bayou and the port canal. But then surrounding that are multiple cities, multiple separate municipalities.
Yep.
So with regards to accuracy and being able to use this efficiently, what would be your recommendation then? I mean, should we add on something? How could we, how can we perhaps get to a little bit more specificity with regards to that major generator out there?
Yeah. One, I would say it's making sure that there is consistency in the boundary for the emissions inventory that was loaded up into the model, the GPC, as we saw right at the start. If we go back to the setup page and then down at the bottom, we saw that there is this emissions inventory that has been specified, and it walks through. So residential buildings, we use this much natural gas, this much electricity. To our point, for the industrial and manufacturing facilities, it's all natural gas use according to the inventory. Transportation, on-road transportation, we've got this much motor oil, this much diesel, so on and so forth. But then we're writing this climate action plan to tackle emissions across a number of different areas, making sure that this inventory, the boundary on which this inventory was completed, aligns with the boundary of the climate action plan. So that would be the first one. And then, to be honest, I think when you start getting to these, let's call them point sources, even though in your case it's a huge point source, stakeholder. At some point, we have to accept the limitations of the model, and you do your calculations within the model for that which it is relevant. Your residential emissions, your hotel load, everything else. And then when you get your results for that, you can tabulate them, take them into an Excel sheet outside, and do your results plotting or whatever you want to do with the data visualization. But then separately, you will have to do some level of offline calculation for these tailored sources. A generic tool like this can't capture the nature of the port or the refinery. And so there has to be some level of assumptions or calculation done outside, and then plotting.
Yeah, Malcolm, it's also part of a bigger question that Dave is asking, and that's, we realize we have a geopolitical boundary that we're working in.
Yes.
And it's a bit of a lead by example for the city of Houston, and a lot of regions they work on a county basis or a multi-county basis on developing their inventory. Mm-hmm. So I think it's partly the leadership. It's a bit of a leadership question for us, and whether or not how we reach out and start to the county and to the COG. We start looking at a regional, larger region, which starts to address all the logistics out of the port and emissions industry, which over the years have carefully crafted a geopolitical boundary for themselves to prevent us from
we got background music from one of the.
Wow, somebody's got a good beat going there. So that's it might be in our action plan to look at how to reach out to these other, to other jurisdictions.
Yes.
And it's good to know that the model can be flexible for that. So we could step this up and run it again at a county level, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah. The model, to some extent, it is designed for urban cities, if you will, built up regions, but the boundary to that is pretty notional. If you have a fully urban county, then so be it. You could run the model. And to this point around, if you do want a very quick sense of the impact of these large facilities or the division between what is under local control and what is not, you can do the sort of rule of thumb percentage split as we saw and is on the screen at the moment around authority.
Yeah, so, it's good because our oil and gas industry is a bit more tricky.
Yes.
We have the state of Texas has the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions, and it's due to industry. It's pretty high. It's like 35% of our emissions. So getting to that in our, regionally is require quite a discussion.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
For us will be fought in Austin because of our legislature protects that industry.
Yes. Yeah, it's your context is different to pretty much all the other cities within North America because of your industrial base. Most cities, because also C40's membership is mayoral jurisdiction, we tend to be the centers of urban agglomerations. And as such, it's not very often that it's industrialized. The industry's moved out. So yeah, we definitely recognize that your situation's a little different.
Thank you.
I do recognize we're a couple of minutes over. For those who have to leave, of course, feel free. I can stay for a few more minutes if there's outstanding questions, if anyone wanted to ask anything further.
So this is open book enough that we can, as a group, we can get into it. Seems pretty straightforward.
It's user-friendly. The one thing that I would say the biggest things are assumptions. So if we go to, of course, action development, whenever you click these multiple levels, you'll get a summary of what the assumptions are. For you guys, start getting into the custom settings. Really, that's what this is for. That's the level of sophistication that I think you have. External information and external expertise and insight to allow you to set up these custom values. So industrial efficiency, broadly, what sort of levels of efficiency change can we get? Mm-hmm. And similarly, we've done our best to set the model up. So C40 does want our cities to be achieving carbon neutrality. 0 is a very precise number. And as such, when you do the modeling, it's tricky to get the model to hit exactly 0 for all sorts of different reasons. But as part of that, I'd encourage you under setup to look further at the advanced settings. We didn't go through this, but under the advanced settings, we saw global warming, GWP, similar, but under the action level assumptions, you can change what those defaults are for current trends, ambitious action, and maximum. This is all editable if you want to change your rapid prototyping approach. But similarly, what's also available is action level, these are the ones we just looked at. And sorry, this back to your question earlier on freight. There is a more comprehensive list of actions that is available to you. And here, we didn't have freight selected, but you're able to select freight as one of the options. And then if you go back to action development and down to transportation, it hasn't updated, but you'd be able to have freight as one of your emissions reduction options. And under this, under the advanced settings is where you can really start to get into the details of how the model is set up. And that would be the other area that I'd focus. So the model, it's in this difficult place. It's trying to provide users a level of specificity that is appropriate for their needs so that they can trust the outputs that it provides. But yet it's also trying to be a rapid prototyping tool so that you can get a sense of what different actions do in an overall sense. And as always, I do caveat this with the model has been built to work across all of C40 cities. And that spans the likes of Houston and New York, right, Jakarta, Manila, Abidjan, and Cote d'Ivoire. So I think from a little bit of intellectual honesty to recognize that it's not a comprehensive tool because it hasn't been built for one specific city. So having said that, work with Hark. If there's specific questions that come up, send them to me and I'll give you the honest answer of what the model can and can't do for you, and where you may have to look elsewhere for answers. Anyone else? Last questions before we call it?
No, thank you. It's just, I just want to make sure we can input the work we've done so far.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
That's the most important thing to us. We work very hard at informing, establishing targets and going through different policy scenarios.
Yes.
And we just want to make sure that we can translate that in a way that it can get included in the model.
Absolutely, yeah. Anyone else? Not quite last chance, but close. Great. Thank you all for attending. Thanks for staying the extra few minutes over the hour, and good luck. I know these processes are often fraught and not easy, but I think you're on a good track. So good luck with it all. And I'm here as a resource for you. So yeah, work with City, work with Hark, and we'll do what we can to support you in this.
Thank you, Malcolm, from the City of Houston.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Take care.